All right, I just want to see, how do I share? Share the presentation. There we are, share screen. I'll put into presentation mode just because I've got some animation there we're going to want to go through. All right, can everybody see my cover page?
We can.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, I'll get right into it then. And yeah, feel free to ask questions as we go and take us through a couple different sections. And very broadly, here to talk to you today about turning data into meaningful stories and how I've done it through my career, through some of the different stages I've stopped at. I want to actually start by asking a question to the group: is what is data? And anyone feel free to just shout out an answer.
You'll have to unmute yourself.
I'm gonna have a few of these little questions throughout, so be ready.
Collected information.
Yeah, Beatrice, that's a great answer. Anyone want to build on that?
It's like specifically facts and statistics that are collected and then analyzed.
Yeah, that's great. Perfect definition. Let me now ask the next question. So that's data. What's an insight?
I think it's kind of being able to look at the data and see certain patterns and what can change and what hasn't changed.
Yeah, Alice, that's a good build. Anybody else? So this is a classic conundrum in the insights industry that we often are challenged with defining the difference between data and an insight. And it's important to keep it in mind because as you do move from data to insight to good storytelling, the best of stories are told when you're dealing with the level of insights. Insights, Alice, you hit sort of on it that as you do take the raw data, which is how we define data, any measurement in its raw form effectively, as you take that, you dig in deeper, you move into the whys, you start to get into the emotions and the behaviors for what's really behind that data. And that's when you get to what a true insight is. So to give a simple example from one of my old worlds, which I'll talk about in just a second, we know that roughly 90% of Canadian households have cereal in the pantry. That's your data point. The insight behind it is the why is the cereal in the pantry. It's not just because it's relatively inexpensive and it's available, it's something that's common, but it's because it allows for, say, a quick and convenient morning option when the morning is haggard. It allows the parents to feel like they're emotionally connecting to their child when they're giving them food while they're trying to get ready for their own workday. And if that emotional state is what you're talking about, then you've got a much more compelling story that your audience is going to listen to, that your agencies can pick up on and build something from, and that's just going to be much more memorable to your end user. So I want us to keep that in mind, kind of difference between data and an insight and why we're always drilling in to get to that deeper form. So let me back up and talk about my insights journey so far. Kind of why am I here? Why is Ron asking me to come speak with you? There's, very broadly, the world of consumer insights marketing research, there's two broad sides to it. So there's client side and supplier side. Clients, quite simply, are the ones who have a research need and they buy the need from an agency. Supplier side are those who actually execute the research. Ron spent some of his time at a supplier side. I'm right now on that supplier side. So my journey is I started as head of insights for Loblaw companies, so the grocery retailer and drugstore retailer that we all have some experience with, I'm sure, especially nowadays. And I spent about 5 years there digging into the insights behind how people chose one box or the other, what people thought about the President's Choice brand and the No Name brand, and about Galen Weston as a spokesperson, how people shop the meat aisle. There's research and insight, data and insight behind each of those. From those, I got interested to understand, the part about brand building. Brands are so interesting because it's how these things live in the hearts and minds of consumers. I want to get deeper to what are brands. So from there, I moved to Kellogg's. As a consumer packaged goods company, Kellogg's is one of the great ones when it comes to building brands like the Procter & Gamble's of the world and the Unilevers and other great brands that you know and love. And here there's a lot of data that's collected and nurtured into insights to help really understand what is this brand, what is this Kellogg's brand. Special K, Fruit Loops, Pringles, Nutri-Grain, and so forth. So that was as head of Canadian Insights for Kellogg's. From there, an opportunity came up to build an insights function for Canada Goose. They had just gone public, and as part of their IPO, they needed to create an insights function to better get to the hearts and minds of consumers for what built that brand from a parka company to where they're moving to today. So moved there for a few years. And then from there, after sort of introducing the function there, decided to move back to the research supplier side to be able to conduct research and understand how to build brands across the globe. And now I'm at a company called Hotspex, where that's what we do, founded primarily on emotions and behavior, which we all know are the true drivers of behavior. So that's my journey so far. And all that time I've spent a lot of time converting data into insights, telling stories, convincing stakeholders at Loblaws, Kellogg's, and Canada Goose around the proper course of action. And that takes a requirement to be compelling to people, a way to take the data and make it something that's going to be meaningful to them, they'll actually action on. So we're going to spend a bit more time now talking about that. Question for the team now. So given sort of some of the role I've talked about, what's the role of the marketing research function? What's the role of marketing research more broadly? Question for the group.
I can answer.
Sure. Ron, what's your best guess? Well, you'll know this.
To inform the stakeholders, management, about information that they can use, insights to make better decisions.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. Great definition. And bridges perfectly into this. This is sort of a visualization of that stakeholder informing. So typically marketing research functions, you've got sort of your marketing research insights function with marketing as the key stakeholder you're dealing with. That's often what the perception is. The reality is there are it's a multifaceted beast that you're often dealing with. So you're bringing data and insights to marketers to help understand how to build brands, to your sales associates and organization to help understand what's happening with the shopper in the store and how to sell that story in, to finance to understand what's the ROI of an initiative, to the C-suite, so the CEO, the CSO, the CFO, to understand how are we going to adjust the course of our overall ship based on what we know about the consumer. And why is that important? Because one of the first lessons around any sort of storytelling, any sort of presentation is always to know your audience. So whether you're speaking to a marketing person, a salesperson, the chief financial officer, the C-suite, that same batch of data, that same insight that you're trying to communicate will have a different audience and will have a different impact that you're trying to make. You're trying to influence them in a very different way. So by knowing who that audience is, how they think, what are their KPIs, what are their drivers, you're able to tailor your message a lot more effectively to have a lot more impact to them. Do a little experiment. And this can be done just in your heads. I know we've got a bunch of folks on the phone, so bear with me here. So show you this word. What word comes to mind over here? If you want to shout it out, please do. If not, just keep it in your mind. Soap, right? Majority of you would have said soap. Let's try that again. What word comes to mind here?
Soup.
Soup.
Soup, exactly. Exact same prompt, which was SO space P, but now something different comes to mind. Why am I saying that? Why does that matter? Sort of lesson number 2 in terms of good storytelling is that context matters. By setting the context in advance, by pre-priming your brain with words like washing and dirty, it led to soap. By pre-priming your brain with words such as chicken and spoon, it prompted you the context to think of soup. So therefore, context matters. And there again, when you're telling your story, when you're thinking about who it is that you're going to be speaking to, you have to understand what's their context. So if it's your marketer, you understand broadly that they're looking to understand the hearts and minds of consumers, and therefore how can they create a compelling brief to an agency to build a brand, build, say, a creative campaign. Is the context that they're thinking about, is it their annual review of the brand, in which case they might be looking for more high-level overall reviews of how has the brand done, what are the data points and insights throughout the year. Or is there context that it's something very specific they're trying to do? It's a brief for brand XYZ for a digital campaign, in which case the stories you tell them, the insights that you bring them are going to be much more important. So the context in which you're speaking matters. Now, the purpose of this is to talk about turning data into stories. Why do stories actually matter? Why can't we just show a bunch of graphs and assume that our end users are going to understand? And simple reason being is that that's not how human beings learn. There is a ton of science on this now, especially more in the past 10 years. Kind of storytelling has become the big thing that everyone's trying to focus more and more on. And depending on which neuroscience journal you look at, the number on the left will be slightly different, but roughly 6 in 10, 63% greater recall of things, of stuff, when it's told via story versus when it's simply a data table. So simply put, by telling people stories, you do increase their ability to remember what it is that you're trying to get them to take away. Furthermore, we know, and the neuroscience will show, that when human beings learn via compelling stories being told, the brain releases a series of neurochemicals, 3 of which are dopamine, cortisol, oxytocin. Cortisol, that's your stress hormone, it helps to focus your attention. Oxytocin is associated with care, with connection, with empathy. Dopamine is associated with just overall arousal, just overall heightened firing of your neurons. Collectively, the impact of that is that it makes what's being told much more memorable because they're much more focused. It's connected to care, connection, empathy, so there's that emotional connection they're feeling towards what you're saying. They're going to remember it, and ultimately, it's actually going to drive their action. Furthermore, stories make complex concepts much, much more approachable. Has everybody seen the movie Inside Out by Pixar 5-10 years ago? Seeing a lot of heads nodding. So think about what that movie was about. There's beautiful stories about, a girl dealing with her family moving to San Francisco and everything that went with that. But they took something as incredibly complex as the human emotional system, which is not easy to understand by any stretch of the imagination. And they found a way to simplify it. And with a beautiful story and these incredibly compelling characters, as shown on screen here, for example, they made the human emotional system something that was approachable. And because it's Pixar, they did it in an incredibly fun and exciting storytelling way. That remains one of my favorite movies today. So the point there being, again, is that stories make concepts approachable. Something like the human emotional system, incredibly easy to comprehend. You recall the story because it's relatively simple, and then bridging from that by engaging the emotional system, which is sort of a dual need of this, is it leads to higher recall per that neurotransmitter we talked about, the neurochemical releases, and so forth. Quick visualization, I won't go through this whole thing, but this is sort of, as you're telling a story, it's causing neurons to fire, it's building bridges, it's building memory structures. When you're connecting it to the human emotional core, it's further reinforcing those memory structures. So in case you're not convinced, the big aha over there is tell them a story. Don't just tell them data. So that's all the why we want to tell stories from our data to help to convince our end users. Pause there in case there are any questions anyone wants to jump in on before I switch gears a touch. All right, always time at the end, and always goes without saying, after this class, feel free to email myself or email Ron directly, and any questions, I'm happy to answer them. So we've gone sort of through the why we want to tell stories, some things to think about high level in terms of context and knowing your audience. Now we're going to go through just some of the mechanics, like how actually to do that. And for me, this is based on experience. It's based on learning science, especially with adults. And it's going to sound silly to say to get to compelling stories to tell your audience, but start with the data itself. I'll often joke whenever we're doing a new project that the data is coming in, like, let's take a look and let's see what the data is saying to us. What are we pulling from it? And I'm going to go through a checklist in just a second, which shows some of our thinking that guides us through it in a very tactical way. But again, you obviously want to start with the actual data itself. It takes time. So processing data through compelling analytics into deep insights that you can then use to talk to an audience about, it's a muscle that just takes time to exercise. So you know, the stat here, 10,000 hours, it's the, what's the trope there, that it takes roughly 10,000 hours to become a master at everything, of anything, which is roughly 5 years of full-time work. And myself, for example, I spent the first literally year of my life just double checking other people's data. So staring at thick stacks of data tables. Ron, if you remember those from back in the day when you got the printed data tabs, and now it's all online, but the thick stacks, just flipping through, looking at data. So starting with the data, and as you read through more of it, as you do it more often, you start to more quickly pick up on patterns, and you start to more quickly understand what is the red thread that I'm picking up over here. What's the actual story? I'm going to keep using the word that people that I need to tell to my audience. It's a very iterative process. So very rarely are you ever building a report that you go through, you pull the data, and that's it, you're done. Oftentimes you see something which sends you into another direction, and you want to understand what that direction is. You see something that stirs a new hypothesis. I wonder what's behind that data. It helps to have a sounding board, someone that can sort of pull you out of the weeds of the data and actually question what you're saying, challenge what you're saying, have you think about things differently. So always kind of buddy up on doing these things, and just keep this looping process, build in the time to do this properly. And just keep on asking why. You get from the data to the insight by always saying why. Why is that happening? Why is that the case? And then finding new data that actually backs that up and reinforces that. So in the very simple cereal example I gave you earlier at the start is, you know, at Kellogg's, we could have just started with the data that, okay, 90% of Canadian households eat cereal. Okay, great. There's your data point. Let's give that to an agency and go build commercials around that. But they would look at us and say, I don't know what to do with that. It's 90%, it doesn't mean anything. So by us constantly iterating to say, okay, why is that? Why are 90% of Canadian households eating cereal? Okay, because it's convenient, it's relatively inexpensive, it's at their grocery store, it's a familiar and comfortable food. Why is that? Okay, because they've been eating it since their childhood, or because it's something that makes them think about a certain nutritional claim. And now you start to see all the branches and tendrils will expand from that one data point. So let me take on the childhood one. Okay, why is that happening? Well, because it's something that the certain consumer ate at a certain time and associates with feelings of warmth from mom at the kitchen table. And now you start to see, as you keep asking why, and you back all these up with data, of course, that you start to get to a much richer place, that a simple data point of 90% cereal consumption now becomes a very interesting human moment. You're humanizing the data in the end. And that's what you're looking to do through this very iterative process. At Hotspex, we have, so this is what we do at Hotspex, is we start with the data and we have to convert that into something that our clients find meaningful that helps to drive their business. We have a process, every agency will have its own process, but roughly, I'm sure Ron had a process back in his day on this side, but roughly the process we'll follow is start with the brief, and simply put, what is the question that you're trying to answer? So you're staring at a set of data. What was the question or questions that drove me to want to go collect the data to answer this? So start with the brief, take a step back and start generating hypotheses. So, okay, my hypothesis is that we're going to see high cereal consumption. We're going to see a skew towards one age group or the other, one demographic marker versus the other. And here's why I think that cereal might have a certain emotional footprint here or there. Let me look into that. That gives me a data point I want to look at. And that helps you start to build your analytic plan. Is what actual data do I want to pull and possibly conduct some additional analyses on, whether it's regressions, correlations, whatever the actual data itself may be. That generates your top line report. Let me start to build let me lay out what the blocks are and see how that story flows. And keep this iterative, talk to other people. In our case, we'll stop and talk to our client to say, here's what we're thinking high level. How do you feel about this? Are there any red flags? Are there any landmines we might step on by saying something like this? And then that eventually leads into the full report. And may seem like a relatively simple roadmap, but by following this, it's able to help us get to where we need to get to for our projects. Pause there for a second in case there's any questions before I start to move into just a few case studies. Okay. All right, I'm going to give just a few case studies now. I'm deliberately not going to show data because that's not the important part of this, quite honestly. It's more about sort of how do we get to from our hypotheses to being able to stir action with my stakeholders. So I'm going to start with another thought experiment for the team, is who can shout out what does Canada Goose stand for? When you think about this brand, what does it stand for? And there's no right or wrong answers because it's your perception.
Warmth.
Warmth, yeah. Good start, Ron. Anyone else?
Brand.
Mm-hmm. Brand, yeah. Anyone else?
Canadian.
Uh-huh.
Adventure.
Adventure, yeah, good word. That's a good one. All right, so we do this with, back when I was at Canada Goose, I'll say we a lot, but obviously I'm not there anymore. So we did this with consumers, and we also did this internally. And very broadly, these are the words that tend to come out. So warmth was captured, Canada was captured, adventure was not, but that's often captured in the word cloud. This isn't the full and final one. But we would have tended to hear words like, so warmth, snow, parka, quality, expensive. Fur is always part of the conversation when it comes to Canada Goose. We'll hear some negative words. So douchey, quite frankly, comes up, or some version of it, depending on which audience who you're speaking with. So given that that's typically what the brand stands for, we have the conversation internally around how do you extend this brand beyond warm parkas? Because people will only buy so many parkas. These things are made literally to last for life. So once you buy one, theoretically, it's going to last you as long as you need it to. As a product, it's great. As a business model, it's not very good. It doesn't make bringing revenue in the easiest. And there was this desire by the C-suite there to move beyond warm parkas into other stuff. And we found, quite frankly, always sort of stalled as we were moving into sweaters and spring wear and so forth. A lot of other premium/luxury brands have done this successfully. So, Louis Vuitton started off as a luggage manufacturer 100 years ago. Coach started off making wallets, and now they've expanded into basically full store. You can buy anything from them, from wallets to jackets to purses to whatever else it may be. So it's a business model that obviously a lot of brands have done. How does Canada Goose do it when that is what is known for their brand? So we collected did a lot of consumer research, quantitative research, qualitative research. So we went around the globe, literally 11 countries, focus groups in France, in China, in UK, Italy, US, a bunch of others, to understand what consumers thought about the brand. We did a lot of quantitative research, so surveys of literally tens of thousands of consumers. And we had a whole lot of data. And all the data clearly showed that this is what we were known for. However, we did have permission to move into certain categories, but it would have to be done cautiously. And whenever we would tell that to our internal stakeholders that we've got the data shows we're known for warmth, we need to move cautiously in, oftentimes they would just dismiss it because our initial ingoing ways of telling them the story were simply through showing data. And we scrubbed the data, we massaged it, we built reports coming out of it, which were ever more visually compelling. However, we found, especially depending on the audience, it just wasn't overly impactful to them. They weren't listening, they weren't taking it away. So as we step back, we kind of went back to the first principles I started with. Okay, who's my audience? What's the context? And the audience in this case was oftentimes the C-suite. So it was the CEOs, the CFO. It was our head of design and merchandising, the person responsible for actually making the product. And because they've been with the company for a long time, they had their own preconceptions around what the brand stands for and how to move. And they had this sort of halo effect that the brand is awesome. It can do anything it wants to do. If we build it, they will come, despite the data showing that no, that is not the case. And then in chatting with them, something really dawned on me, which was that, they built the company from the ground up, a lot of these executives. The way they did that is by going to stores, talking to people, hearing what they want, and then going back and making it. So therefore, they're very influenced. Their context, them as the audience, are very influenced by what the customers themselves in situ are saying to them, and less so by a boring chart of data, as pretty and beautiful as we made it. So that made me step back and say, okay, let me go back to the qualitative research and simply pull 2 quotes that are directly from consumers, play them the videos, and these on their own would have more impact than any piece of data that I could show them. Give you a second, as I know you're all reading these right now. So these two quotes, I paraphrase these from the quotes from the work, of course, but these 2 quotes perfectly and accurately summarize the things I wanted them to take away, which was that there wasn't knowledge of the other things that we made, and there was skepticism that it would actually be decent if we did make it, and that we were seen as a parka company, so therefore stick with it. So by telling them the story in this way, by converting all the reams of data, tens of thousands of data points from the quantitative research, hours and hours of videos from all the focus group research in a series of different languages, boiling that down to 2 simple quotes, because in the end I knew that that's what would influence my end users. This drove them to action and caused them to then take a different approach to how they actually made the product. This and other things, can't take full credit by any means, how they made the product and how they marketed the product. And one example then is it led to the realization that there was an emotional connection to the winter wear that we were making, but there was not one to the spring wear, because we were treating it the same way as the winter wear. And we had to just take a different approach. So this is just one sample from a campaign launched in spring 2019, which was very much around showing the product. That's a spring jacket in situ, connecting with the art community, the community of photographers. This is a famous photographer whose name completely escapes me right now, to help give it credibility and help give it buy-in that helped to drive sales of the spring product overall, and that line continues to grow.
Joe,
Mm-hmm.
did you give any insight into thinking through social responsibility in any way, like environmentally or for other causes related to it?
Sorry, Ron, it cut out a little bit. Do you mind repeating that?
Did the information you gleaned from the data, were you able to look at any social responsibility causes that would kind of relate well with the brand?
We did, and that actually bridges nicely into my my next section. But yeah, absolutely, and especially, we know that fur is a very polarizing and controversial topic, and Canada Goose is often caught in the middle of that. By no means do I want to get into that on this topic or on this conversation right now, but to say that they would often look into exactly that. And let me actually bridge into, so actually, Ron, without knowing, you've perfectly set up this next section, so thank you for that. Is kind of related to moving into spring wear, which is still a very functional thing. Canada Goose, known as a functional product, it is good because it defends you from the elements, full stop. How do you inject more purpose into the brand? And more and more in the past, probably 5 to 10 years, purpose has become something that every brand is trying to build themselves based on. Basically, why do you exist in the world aside from just selling products? And we've seen some really great examples in the apparel category, especially in the past few years, of brands speaking to their purpose. So the famous Kaepernick Nike campaign from about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. Patagonia, their purpose is all around people and planet and trying to preserve the planet. And for a company whose business purpose is to drive shareholder value via selling stuff, for them to actually say to the world, hey, don't buy this jacket, like that's them leaning into their purpose. This was on, I think this was a Black Friday campaign where every other brand is leaning to say, hey, look at all the cool stuff we want to sell you on Black Friday. These are saying, you know what, don't buy anything this day, actually. Just take a step back. Don't buy this jacket. Apparel is one of the greatest polluters of the planet and so forth, and we want to live by our values, live by our purpose. North Face very much leaning into US political debates with their purpose, which again, very much leaning into who they want to be as a brand. So for a brand like Canada Goose, how do you lean into your purpose? How do you define what your purpose is, first of all, and how do you lean into it, considering, as we established before, this is what they're effectively known for? So this, again, was another challenging conversation to have internally, because back to Ron's point, a lot of that data that we had, we would have work on corporate social responsibility that we could lean into. And actually, Canada Goose is high on CSR. There's a lot of sponsorship of polar bears and northern Inuit communities, shipping products to the north to create product. I know they're doing a bunch of stuff right now, given the current current climate of the world, but it wasn't breaking through to consumers, and it was seen. So two issues. It wasn't breaking through to consumers, and it was seen by the organization as sort of a campaign, as sort of just something that we do, as opposed to who we are, and that's a very different way of behaving. Patagonia and North Face, they behave with their purpose. Patagonia made a statement about a year and a half ago that they no longer want to sell their vest to certain segments of the population that they did not feel reflected their brand values. Whereas Canada Goose is still looking to sell. So how do you develop that purpose? So there again, we had a series of data in this case. So the data came from consumers, similar work as I talked about before. So focus groups, quantitative research. We had data points talking about associations with CSR initiatives. We had a good sense of what sort of a brand we wanted to be, but it still wasn't enough to convince the organization to rally around that. And we would show all those data points in a lot of our executive meetings, still not convincing folks it was anything more than a campaign. So there again, sort of stepping back, going back to the first principles of who is it that we're trying to influence. In this case, the chief financial officer, trying to influence the CEO, trying to influence our heads of design. And so we pulled a bunch of data which showed what's the company going to care about ultimately. They don't understand, as they're not traditional brand builders, how purpose can lead to stronger brands, which can ultimately lead to higher ROI and stronger sales. So we pulled some data, actually repurposing some data from our friends at Kantar at the time, which just basically showed, Kantar is really great on doing a lot of work on brand purpose, showing that brands with a higher commitment to purpose and perceived higher commitment to purpose are growing at twice the rate of others. So showing a stat like this to the CFO was much more compelling to him to want to lean in and support our campaigns for brand purpose. I don't have the data points to show you over here, but this is where that iterative process and that why comes in. I pulled other data points from HR organizations, which I showed to our head of HR, for example, that brands with stronger purpose have an easier time hiring and retaining employees and a much more engaged employee workforce. That brands with purpose do a much better job, get higher footfalls into stores and higher rings, so higher sales, which for our head of sales was very much more compelling to him. And then for our head of marketing, a stat like this was very compelling to her. So there again, moving beyond just the consumer data and looking at what other data can I have that rounds out the story and ultimately helps to convince the end users, the stakeholders, around a course of action. Finally, they bought in, and then that led into starting with 2018. This is just one example of it. Our purpose-based campaigns where, as we sat around as a marketing organization, how do we take our core promise of warmth as a functional thing and expand it into something more? And that now working with our creative agencies became very much around this world of emotional warmth. So tapping into the relationships that we all have with other human beings, whatever that may be, that those relationships tend to really boil over positive ways. That phrase may be the wrong phrase, but tend to spill over, especially around the holidays. And that's when we tend to celebrate those around us more than any other time of the year. And connecting our functional and our emotional purposes into one campaign. These are just some sample stills from it. And by doing this, we did see growth in our brand, in how we measured it in terms of the strength of the brand and some of the emotional associations with the brand where we wanted them to be. And then in actual sales around the time of year based on the products featuring, but also adjacent products that we weren't. So net, drawing in on the context, knowing the audience, iterating, looking at different data points, different ways to tell that story to the stakeholders in ways that would influence them. So I'll pause there in case there's any other questions there. All right, I'll give just, cognizant of time, I'll give one or two more from my Kellogg's life, and then sort of wrap us up and give you guys the lecture time, rest of the lecture time back. So, all right, Kellogg's. So cereal is an old category. It's roughly 110 years old, give or take. If you look back at when Mr. Kellogg developed the very first one as a health subsidy for to support the mental health community around him in Battle Creek, Michigan at the time. And being an older category hasn't necessarily evolved with the times. And with millennial shopping behaviors, millennial food behaviors very much changing, how do we as a brand, how do we as a category, as an organization evolve? But probably for me, the challenge was, how do I connect the millennial target consumer with my C-suite, who are primarily boomers? So there's a 20 to 30 year age difference, and there's not quite a connection between them. Why is this important? Is because the boomer grew up in a very different world than millennials are growing up in. So with millennials, it's much more around urban living, where pantry space becomes more of an issue. You don't have these big suburban homes that these massive boxes of cornflakes can nicely slide into. More often it's single person households, meaning you don't need these huge boxes. You might need something smaller, and there's much more diversity in the types of foods being eaten in the morning. There's a much higher nutritional focus around things like gluten-free, and grain and wheat alternatives, around the protein content, around milk alternatives. Traditionally, cereal's always been positioned and sold as something that you put in a bowl with spoon and milk, and that's how you consume it. But with the rise in milk alternatives, what's that going to mean for how consumers are shopping? So here again, we had a bunch of data. We did shop-alongs with consumers as the insights in the marketing function, shop-alongs with consumers to understand how are they shopping, meaning quite literally, how do they walk around the store, pick up boxes, look at it, and make decisions. What goes in the cart? What goes back on the shelf? What are they looking for? What are they spending? How many things are they buying at a time? Are they filling up an SUV with a Costco's worth of shopping, or is it simply whatever they can carry from their urban grocery store to their urban condo, which again is part of that urban living? So we had that qualitative research. We had the quantitative research around perceptions of cereal and nutrition and foods and so forth. And there again, we would give the traditional reporting back up to our C-suite, let them know all the stats were there around changing shopping values for millennials, what they want, what they need, what their nutrition needs are. And the C-suite still just wasn't getting it. They weren't evolving the business quickly enough to meet the needs of the ever-changing consumer. But the reason is because they just weren't internalizing what it is that we were telling them. So in presenting time and again, it sort of became obvious, again, trying to learn who my head of sales was and our CEO, what's their engagement with the data, with the consumer, and oftentimes their exposure to the store, the actual store where products change hand, would be when they would go visit a buyer. So they would go visit the category manager for cereal at Loblaws at a store, which is a very different lens for them to be able to see. They're not internalizing, they're not appreciating the data that we're telling them. So what I did again is, knowing that there were sort of the top 5 or 6 insights I wanted them to take away, some of which are presented on the screen over here, I built a series of shop-alongs with consumers, only a handful of them, and actually brought my C-suite through on them. So my version of telling them the story, what they needed to hear, was knowing that they're influenced by what they're seeing in the store. The challenge is what they're seeing in the store is not true to life. It's only whatever the category buyer is willing to show them. They're not hearing directly from the consumers. So simply put, I set up a series of shop-alongs where I literally took my president and a consumer through the store to watch how the consumer shopped. The consumers were very deliberately recruited to make sure that they were expressing and living the values that we knew were representative of the new millennial cereal consumer. And in taking them through, my president, my head of sales, my head of marketing heard directly from the consumer all the things that we've been telling them through constant data points and charts and graphs. And through that one simple 30-minute shop along, it influenced them and convinced them more than any other piece of data I could show them. So there again, knew who I was dealing with, knew the context that they were used to learning in, knew the the insights I want them to pick up, and found a way to marry them up together in something that's much more different and exciting versus a simple report.
Hey, Joe, did
Yeah.
the recruited participants, were they aware they were being observed?
They were, yes, of course. So good point. So whenever you do shop along research, any sort of qualitative research, you always let your consumers know for ethical reasons and legal reasons that they are being observed. So typically what happens in a case like this is you would meet the consumer, you recruit them. There's a series of questions you ask as you're recruiting them to understand their food values, their demographics, to make sure it's the type of person that you want to recruit for that work. You'd meet them in the vestibule of the store. And typically the first thing that you do is all the legal stuff. So there's a waiver they often have to sign. You introduce yourself, you introduce your business partner. So say, you know, my president or my head of sales, and you're very transparent with who everybody is. If you're recording, which in these cases we did not, but if you're recording, you'll tell them that you are. They'll say we're either video recording or audio recording, and the purpose of the recording, which is often just for reporting purposes, never to be released. Make sure they're clear with that, they're comfortable, and then you move right into the actual questioning. And typically, you know, the concern with doing that is always by reminding people they're being observed, it might affect their behavior, their responses. And no doubt there always is some of that. But oftentimes, once you get into the conversation, people quickly forget that this is actually an experiment effectively you're conducting with them, and they go about their regular behavior. Part of it is that people love talking about, sorry, go ahead, Ron.
So before you were with Hotspec, we hired you to do a segmentation study at the Toronto Pearson International Airport.
Yep. And
in addition, we did some qualitative research, just like you did here, but we actually had us follow around kind of heavy users of the airport, so those that are super flyers, to try to figure out the pain points related to travel and what the experience was going through the airport, and if there were things that were bothering them or things they loved, all the way right to when they got onto the plane, Air Canada specifically.
Mm-hmm.
What we found out was really interesting, in that the bottlenecks were the biggest problem. The bottlenecks caused the flyer to be less happy with the overall experience, and therefore also spent less in the airport. So we weren't generating as much non-aeronautical revenue from their overall experience. So it was very similar. That's interesting. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting work. So, and those shop-alongs are so compelling because people tell you a lot. One reason why they're interesting, and you know, Ron, I'm curious in that case, you know, without the shop-alongs, would it have been as rich to get through a quant survey? Sometimes it's the quality emotions that people are expressing, and that's really where the story is told. Yeah, and people, what I found is, one reason why I say this, like, it's such an innocuous category, it's cereal, right? It's harmless basically. But because people are not used to being asked about just these everyday things, like how you buy cereal or how you buy a jacket or how you shop the meat counter, thinking of my Loblaws days, they're excited to talk about it. And then the other thing I'll find, actually, you know, pro tip for the class over here is, if you're ever doing work in a store environment, in any sort of public environment, people will often give you about 3 minutes of your time for free. So if you're doing a research project to understand, in this example, how people are shopping the cereal aisle, you don't necessarily need to hire a full-on research company. If there's only one thing you want to know, just walk up to people. And oftentimes, like, hey, do you mind if I ask you a quick question? Like, why did you choose that box of Frosted Flakes? Like, that's interesting. Then they'll tell you why. You might get one more question out of them before they then, you know, scurry and go on their way, wonder why you're talking to them. But people will give you that little bit of free time. So there's like I said, pro tip, as you're working on your projects for this course or any other course, it's a source of quick, free data. Now, obviously, use it carefully, because who you ask, the answers you get back could bias what your overall insights are. So do it often enough that you're hearing consistency in responses that you can pluck out to generate your story. But it's a good way to even just validate sometimes what you're thinking. We would do this oftentimes here. Like, even for me, whenever I would do my own personal shopping, say on the weekend, I'd walk the cereal aisle as head of insights at Kellogg's and just ask people instantly. I would sit back and watch sort of, how is this family personified on the screen here? What are they picking? So the daughter's pointing at a box of Nesquik. is the dad going to pick it up? And if he does, is he going to put it in the cart or not? If he does, is like, you can quickly ask him, hey, can I just ask, like, why'd you grab that? You'll get a quick insight from him and move on your day. So, all right. Last example, I'll blow through this one quickly because it's, similar approach, basically how to showcase Canadian food values to US decision makers at Kellogg's. What was behind here is that we would oftentimes Kellogg's being a US company, would often treat the Canadian business as the 51st state. So basically whatever food they made for the US market, ship it up to Canada, it's gonna sell up there. Now we know in Canada that our food values are very is a bit of a strong word, but they are different from the US's. So different perspective of the ingredients that we care about, the formats we want to consume things in, large format, small format, carry along, whatever it may be. The nutrient needs are very different. Different flavor profiles as a result of the beautiful tapestry that is our food landscape here. Different perceptions of the acceptable amount of fat, sugar, and salt, the three big baddies in our foods. So therefore, any food coming from the US is not necessarily going to land with Canadian markets. Had all the data from nutrition science, from Canada's Food Guide, which is where this image is from our consumer research in Canada, the US to show that, but there again was not landing with the US parents. Realized that, so we knew all that, we wanted them to understand we're a different market, so we get a different innovation chain coming from them and have more control over the foods we're creating and bringing up to Canada. Realized that a lot of the US my US business partners, thinking we were just the 51st state, had never really actually spent a lot of time in Canada. And when they did, it was flying into Pearson, driving to our office, hotel, corporate dinner, back to Pearson, right back home again. So my way of influencing them was to immerse them in our food landscape. And we literally built a food immersion tour, I called it. Took them through Kensington Market, took them through a couple areas on the west side of Toronto, a few restaurants that were really leaning into food culture. And by exposing them in this way to a very small slice, but a slice of Canadian food culture, to these small restaurants that were really innovating and pushing the envelope for flavor profiles, for the nutrients, the formats, and so forth, it opened their eyes that, you know what, we are a very different food culture, because they didn't see stuff like that in central Michigan where their head office is. And doing that alone, again, helped to influence and open up the doors to a more free-flowing Canadian-controlled innovation chain where we could make a lot more of our own custom foods. So small example, but there again is reinforcing that point that when, how to pull the data, what to look for, we talked about how to drill into that, but any technique for telling your story is on the table, within reason, of course, as long as it fits the context of how your end user is thinking, which in this case, again, like something very novel, like taking them on a tour, like literally having 10 business executives from Kellogg's walking through Kensington Market and trying different foods and having their minds opened about how different we are as a culture. So wrapping it all up, we went through a bunch of different chapters. So difference between data and insights, always drilling in, taking the raw data, finding the why behind it, the emotions. That's where you can influence your end user. That's what answers the brief. That's what's the most compelling part, where the role of research is to serve as that conduit between insights and stakeholders. The role of the research, whether you are simply conducting one project or whether you're actually managing a function, as I'm doing, it is to influence the end users based on where their blind spots are. The context of the data you're pulling, of the storytelling, matters. If people are not able to absorb data in one way, absorb insights in a certain way, find a different way, find what their triggers are, and that's how you convince them or that's how you get them to understand and assimilate what it is that you're trying to get them to learn. Storytelling is important because it helps build emotional connections with your end users. Think about your own personal lives, is when you're getting together with friends on the weekend, you're telling each other stories. You're not sharing data from your week. You're saying, this week, this crazy thing happened, and that makes it interesting. It's what you laugh at, it's what you cry at. It's no different in a business context. As human beings, we are hardwired to absorb things via stories and not via raw data points. And then turning data into insights, there's the very tactical, mechanical things. that I mentioned earlier on around it's iterative, spend time with it, keep asking why, go back to the brief, what are you trying to address? And then as you dig further and further into it, you'll get to that compelling bit to then find an interesting way to tell to your end users. And that's all I prepared. Happy to answer any additional questions.
All right, guys. I have a question.
Sure.
And that is, if you were in this class and you were given a project, let's say, to pick an event in the city and do a research project on it, and you had to do one form of qualitative research and one form of quantitative research. And let's say you found out that the problem was we are right now in a state of uncertainty with COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
And the event was TIFF, as an example.
Yep.
And you wanted to find out ways to connect to your current audience, but still attract new audiences. But you realize you may not have a festival, but we're sure. What do you think you would do to get some information from your potential customers or guests? What kind of study you might do in that situation?
Yeah, great question. I'll start by saying that right now, the research community is thriving. So from our perspective, we're still seeing really great response rates to online surveys. We're still seeing high quality data coming through. Kind of the running joke is everyone's home. So you've actually got a lot more access to people who are able to conduct research, within limits, obviously. So the actual notion of conducting research should not be called into question. Do not be concerned about that. Both types, very broadly, quantitative and qualitative research, are easily on the table. Qualitative research, things like focus groups, of course, shop-alongs, all of that, obviously that requires human contact. We've actually been conducting a lot of qualitative research via in-depth interviews. So exactly using tech like this, we're doing one-on-ones and we're doing focus groups. Same thing, there's a bunch of faces on the screen and there's the moderator and having a conversation. So those methodologies themselves are still perfectly sound. Be very confident in them. You're able to execute them. Depending on the audience you want to go after, depending on the types of questions you're trying to address, you would theoretically, if you have a relationship with the TIFF organization, you could theoretically get access to their database of subscribers and reach out to them to conduct research. And once you have their contact name, then it could be qual, it could be quant that you want to do, but you've got the initial contact point. If not, then there's a lot of sample providers you might be able to access who would be able to do a poll of Torontonians, and I don't know what the incidence rate is of attendance or awareness of TIFF, but my guess it's relatively high, which again, be confident that you would likely have no issues finding people to talk to about this topic. So that's number one. And then in terms of quant or qual, there it really comes down to what it is that you want to know. If it is around awareness and perceptions of previous TIFFs and which sort of parts of the festival have they liked, are they simply attending the movies, are they going to the after parties, are they attending red carpets, then that to me feels like it could be a bit more of a quantitative exercise where it's checking boxes for things they've gone to, it's using Likert scales and so forth to understand what they've liked, what they haven't liked, satisfaction ratings of each of the things that they have attended. And by doing that, you would get a sense already of, what are the things that people gravitate to? Are we seeing higher attendance and satisfaction with red carpet festivals versus the actual movies themselves? In which case, future TIFFs might want to showcase more of the red carpet events and or just actually have more of them. Versus the opposite, in which case, how do you get more of the movie screenings known? If it is to generate new ideas for what you can do to really raise the profile of TIFF, then that to me could be an interesting in-depth interview or qualitative exercise where you'd want to recruit people who you'd find some way of qualifying them as sort of, moviegoers, as cinephiles, as TIFF loyalists, as whatever the right thing is. because they're more aware and engaged in the industry, and they would have much better feedback for you. You might even look for people who have attended other events like Sundance or Whistler Film Festival, any other film festivals, so they can bring over some of that knowledge. Lastly, so that's more around the actual event itself, but then there's TIFF as a brand. So what does TIFF as a brand stand for? What's the emotional connection people have with TIFF as a brand, and how do you bring that to life? And that as well could be either of those streams. If it's a quantitative stream, you ask a bunch of questions. What do they think about it? What's the emotional appeal of the brand, likes and dislikes? And then it could be a qual conversation as well around like this notion of a film festival and of TIFF as that personification of it. So
that could apply to any event, correct? What you just said, basically.
Sorry, Ron, you broke up a little bit.
That could apply to any event in the city.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Events are brands like everything else. As soon as you say TIFF, to stick to that example, you instantly have an emotional reaction to what that stands for. Basic example, if you love movies, you instantly warm up. If you hate movies, you probably recoil right away at that notion of TIFF. But any other event, even think about an event like the Super Bowl as an event, or the Stanley Cup Championship as an event, as a branded event, which they very much are protected as branded events. Exact same philosophy would apply.
So Alice had a question for you. So
sure.
Go ahead, Alice.
Sorry, I think someone else was also talking. My question was, how long do you typically take to collect data for a campaign? Could be like Kellogg's or anything. Do they give you like a set timeline that you have to hurry by because they want to release their new collection or something? Like, how would that work?
Really great question. The hedge is always, it depends, of course. Nowadays, we're always trying to look for sooner rather than later to try to get decision-making in more quickly. But typically, if it's, say, a Canada-wide study for Kellogg's, and it's asking about overall cereal use and cereal consumption and perceptions of the brand, typically your data collect would take about a week to 10 days, because you send out if it's a quantitative study, you send out your invitation. Your response rate curve will typically do this. So you get a bunch of responses right away within day 1 or 2. You send a reminder, you get a blip, and then it sort of levels off. So it depends on the patience you have and the time you have to be able to keep sending reminders and sort of cut it off. Depends on how large your sample size is. I would say, without knowing the full specifics, sort of give yourself a week or so to allow yourself to send out the initial invitation, collect data, make sure the survey is working as you need it to be working, to send out a reminder, and then maybe one final reminder on sort of day 6 or 7, and then you can close field, pull the data, assuming you're reaching the quotas and the sample sizes you're looking to reach. Alice, does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, guys, so that's good information for you. You should be sending reminders out for your current quant survey that you've deployed, and then apply what he said as things are wrapping up near the end of the time you're collecting the data.
A question. I wanted to know, in terms of with the COVID-19 going on right now, how would you pivot your storytelling? Because right now, you want to be sensitive to what's going on, but you also still want to be able to maintain your brand and your messaging and all that. So how would you kind of pivot your storytelling?
Yeah, really, really good question. It's something that honestly as an industry, we are heavily focused on right now. And so a couple things. Number one, with COVID-19, it's thankfully not affecting, as I said, it's not affecting our ability to conduct research. It is affecting, say, consumer shopping behavior in terms of some of the hoarding and the shopping of certain categories. So depending the type of research you're doing, you have to just be cognizant of that. But I would say more broadly, to answer you directly, is I would take that context into account. So right now, the biggest unifying effect that COVID-19 has on everyone is this feeling of uncertainty and of sort of fear that we all have around what the future holds for us. So I would say just keep that into account, that whoever, as you're pulling your data, just be cognizant of the state that your respondents may have been in as they're responding, in case you're seeing any anomalies in there. be cautious and sensitive to the types of questions if they sort of dance anything around the notion of healthcare, which I don't believe that would necessarily be the case. But then as you are, telling your story around to your end users, just be aware that they themselves may be interpreting it through the lens of uncertainty and fear as humans. But if your end user is actual owners of events or owners of brands, then in their mind, they're going to be thinking like, what's their future for this event? So think about with TIFF as an example. If work is being done for TIFF, the managers and owners of TIFF right now, they don't know if there's going to be a festival in September. So how do they even start planning for it? So they're going to be thinking about that as they're listening to the data that you're bringing to them, TIFF or any other event that you may be thinking about.
Any other questions, guys? You can even ask a question about your own study. All right. Well, thank you very much, Joe. Very insightful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
And really appreciate it. And we will be in touch.
Fantastic. Any further questions, as I said, either find me on LinkedIn, send them through Ron, send it to me directly. And best of luck to you for the rest of the lecture and the rest of the class in your coursework.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everybody.